It is with tremendous pleasure that I introduce our speaker today. Unfortunately, I will have to slip out before the end of the lecture, but our lecture will last about 40 minutes, and then our speaker will entertain questions and will linger. Those of you who have to leave at 1, of course, for other classes and commitments will understand that. But Ana Lucia Araujo is a full professor in the Department of History at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Her research explores the history, memory, and heritage of slavery. She authored or has edited over 10 books on these themes, including Public Memory of Slavery, Victims and Perpetrators in the South Atlantic, Shadows of the Slave Past, Memory, Heritage, and Slavery, and Brazil Through French Eyes, a French artist, a 19th century artist in the tropics, which was recently published in Portuguese. She is a member of the Brazilian Studies Association Executive Committee, and last November she joined the International Scientific Committee of UNESCO's Slave Root Project. Her latest single-authored book is Reparations for Slavery and Slave Trade, a Transnational and Comparative History, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2017. And we had the pleasure of having dinner last night, getting to know her a little bit more, and discovered that in different moments in Brazil in the past, we both were really involved in the movement for democracy in the country, and so got to kind of have that connection as well. So with tremendous enthusiasm, I introduce Ana Lucia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much, then, Jim Green and the Watson Institute for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you also, Ramon Stern, for putting together this event.
1 second. You have to applaud.
Then my talk today is going to rely on this new book that I just published, that I'm going to show you the cover of the book, that is titled Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, a Transnational and Comparative History. And here today I will focus on the portions of the book that deal then with Brazil, covering then this history of demands of reparations for slavery in Brazil. Then during the 19th century, as in several societies of the Americas, one of the main arguments that continued supporting the existence of slavery in Brazil relied on the old principle that slaves were property, which could not be confiscated without indemnification. In 1869, an article appeared in Radical Paulistano, a newspaper published by the radical wing of the Liberal Party, denounced the imperial government for failing to enforce the law of 1831 that banned the slave trade to Brazil, and denouncing that the existence of African slaves in Brazil who were arriving who were being imported after the law forbidding the trafficking of enslaved Africans since 1831. Then the article is a tribute to Black abolitionist journalist, lawyer, and poet Luiz Gama. And Gama was born free. He was the son of an African freed woman and a well-to-do, rich man of Portuguese origin, who illegally indeed sold him into slavery when he was just 10 years old. Then in the household of his master, Gama learned how to read and write, and by 1848 he was able to obtain his freedom. And during the 1860s, Gama became one of the greatest Brazilian abolitionists. His articles then are a good example of how Brazilian abolitionists convincingly utilized legal arguments to oppose the claims of slave owners and public authorities who at the time defended slavery. Gama, and this we are talking about a period when slavery was already abolished here in the United States. Gama denounced the illegal enslavement of Africans who had arrived in Brazil after the legal ban of the Atlantic slave trade to Brazil in 1831. Indeed, we know today that more than 786 86,000 enslaved Africans were imported or were introduced in Brazil between 1831 and 1856, then a period when the Atlantic slave trade to Brazil was illegal. But despite then the growth of the abolitionist movement in the 1870s, as in other parts of the Americas, influential Brazilian slave owners and planters, they opposed it by arguing that its suppression, the suppression of slavery, would put in danger the country's agricultural economy. Elites then embraced the idea of gradual and compensated abolition as a path to end slavery, while at the same time avoiding then hurting the interests of slave owners and preventing, of course, violent outcomes. Then, as elsewhere in the Americas, proposals of reparations to the future freed population were absent from the speeches of congressmen. Instead, these politicians, they constantly expressed their anxieties and the anxieties of Brazilian elites who feared freed people's revolt. Then, similar to Mexico, Cuba, and the United States, these early debates revealed the concerns of both liberal and conservatives about how to compensate the masters for the loss of slave property and how to get rid of the populations of African descent by either introducing more European immigrants or sending them outside the national borders. For example, the Free Womb Law contained an article that included possible compensation to slave owners. Then it's not true to say that we didn't have compensation to former slave owners in Brazil. The law that abolished slavery in 1888 didn't contain those measures. But as the abolition was gradual, either with the Free Womb Law or with the sexagenarian law, there were provisions to compensate the slave owners. Yet, until the middle of the 1870s, most Brazilian abolitionists accepted the principle of property rights and the idea of gradual abolition. Even among the abolitionists themselves, there was an agreement regarding that, with the exception of some of the black abolitionists. Although then foreseeing the end of slavery, they rarely publicly opposed the idea of financial compensation to slave owners, as they rather viewed the end of slavery as a simple transition from slave labor to free labor. They could hardly start any kind of discussion addressing the need of financial and material reparations to former slaves. But despite these limitations, by the middle of the 1870s, Brazilian abolitionists brought to the public debate, then for the first time, the issue of land distribution to the future freed population. In the context then of a country where land was highly concentrated in the hands of very few wealthy individuals, redistributing land could certainly be conceived as material reparations for slavery. During the 1880s, then in that decade that slavery was abolished in Brazil, elites continued then to defend the idea that slaves were property and consequently slavery could not end without compensation to the slave owners. Brazilian abolitionists now opposed it. However, in the 1880s, they were now opposing the idea of indemnifying the slave owners and responded to these objections by using legal arguments. For example, in the pages of the newspaper O Abolicionista, Luiz Gama again denounced public auctions of slaves whose announcements contained the ages and the regions of provenance of Africans to be sold, showing that not only that the men and women on sale were born in Africa, but they were also legally brought to Brazil after the first legal ban of slavery, of the slave trade in 1831, showing then that it was a public secret because everybody knew that these Africans could not have been introduced in the country after 1831. Still, they announced it, the sales, the ages, and the regions of provenance, suggesting then that these people were indeed recently introduced or introduced after 1831 in the country. In 1883, then, we are already near the period of, near the moment of the abolition of slavery in Brazil. The manifesto then that created the Confederação Abolicionista in Brazil presented a more radical view of emancipation by rejecting then gradualism and voicing also the idea of immediate emancipation without payment of indemnifications to the masters. The document denounced slave owners who established prices for their slaves that were much higher than their original value in order to obtain the maximum possible amounts from the newly created emancipation funds established all over the country. By explaining then these cases, abolitionists demonstrated that in practice, in manumitting slaves by using the emancipation funds, slave owners were obtaining financial compensation, and I quote, "Immoral industry has no right to compensation. Abolition should be immediate, instantaneous, and without any compensation," unquote. In contrast, however, then, with previous moderate and gradualist views of emancipation, now abolitionists, they calculated the sums due by the slave owners to the enslaved population. Then by bringing the discussion around the amount due to the slaves and not to the slave owners, these abolitionists invoked reparations for slavery in the public sphere, in Brazilian public sphere, perhaps for the first time. In 1884, for example, as the abolitionist movement grew all over the country, the question of material reparations to former slaves through land redistribution emerged with the proposal of a new bill by Manuel Pinto de Souza Dantas, senator of the Liberal Party and president of the Cabinet of Ministers. This was called the Dantos Bill, and this established then not only the emancipation of enslaved men and women greater than 60 years old, but also a series of measures envisioning the future of the newly freed populations, including awarding land, of course, to the former slaves, but also to the European immigrants. Pro-slavery groups submitted then 24 petitions opposing this bill, and emulating then the abolitionist model, they even organized a confederation to oppose the end of slavery. Eventually, when the bill was introduced to the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies in 1884, July 15, there was great opposition by pro-slavery groups and division among the deputies. Then this issue led to the dissolution of the Chamber of Deputies by Dom Pedro II, and a more radicalized abolitionist movement emerging from this context. Then, at the time, Joaquim Nabuco, Rebouças, José do Patrocínio, along with other supporters, they organized then massive street demonstrations in various capitals of Brazil, and now defended then an agrarian reform that would award land to the freed population. In 1885, the Congressman João Maurício Vanderlei, known as Barão de Cotegipe, introduced a new bill that he altered to replace the Dantos Bill. The new bill offered then the possibility to declare the slaves' affiliation as unknown, thereby eliminating the problem of exposing the owners who illegally introduced enslaved Africans after 1831. The bill also included financial compensation to the slave owners. Finally, in 1885, then just 3 years after the abolition of slavery, the sexagenarian law freed enslaved individuals older than 60 years old. But the new legislation also determined that in order to compensate the masters, the newly emancipated slaves should work 3 additional years at no cost or until the age of 65. Unsurprisingly, then this new law did not contain any provision to provide reparations to former slaves. When the Princess Isabel signed the law abolishing slavery in Brazil in 1888, May 1888, in Brazil there were nearly 700,000 slaves who were freed. In the next years, no organized groups pursued claims of reparations for slavery in Brazil. Political instability then marked this period that followed the end of slavery, and the monarchy collapsed just 1 year after, nearly 1 year after the abolition of slavery. But as many of you know, the lack of segregation laws, similarly to other than post-emancipation societies, led then, despite then this lack of segregation laws, the Brazilian government authorities, they feared the newly black enslaved emancipated population, that this new emancipated population would cause social unrest. Both the press and the public authorities portrayed the freed population as dangerous and unfit to live in freedom. Then in the urban areas, white newspapers deny the existence of racism. They continue promoting the idea of integration and propagating then white values of respectability. These publications then, of course, characterized African traditions as barbarian and black culture as inferior. And then this was the context of the post-emancipation. During this period, of course, in Brazil, most former slaves had very few access to land ownership and to basic education. Still, a small number of former slaves, individually or in small groups, invoked symbolic reparations for slavery in their exchanges with government officials. In a letter of April 1889, a commission of freedmen from several plantations in the region of Açores in São Paulo, then a region of the coffee industry, sent a letter to the then General Deputy Rui Barbosa, who would become then a minister. The group made clear that the abolition of slavery had not been a gift from the monarchy and white abolitionists, but the result of their own struggle. And I quote, "We perfectly understand that the emancipation came from the people who forced the crown and the parliament to decree it, and that our freedom was signed in Cubatão, a quilombo or runaway slave community in the quilombo of Cubatão, and therefore we will not raise arms against our brothers, despite having been advised to do so by the courtiers of the palace, our greatest torturers in the past," unquote. The freedmen also reminded Barbosa that the government was still collecting a tax of 5% established by the Free Womb Law to create the Emancipation Fund. They insisted that those funds should be invested in education of freed people's children. And of course, this letter remained without, we don't know the answer of this letter, but we know what happened after. Then in Brazil, like in the United States or Cuba, former planters and slave owners avidly persisted in seeking claims for their alleged moral and material losses. These requests to compensate the former slave owners and planters propelled one of the most controversial episodes of Brazilian post-emancipation period. You know that in December 1890, Barbosa issued a decree ordering the burning of all papers of books of register and documents related to slavery housed in the offices of the Ministry of Finances. Barbosa's decision was interpreted at the time as an attempt to erase the traces of slavery in Brazil. With the approach of the centennial of the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1988, a number of publications then engaged in rehabilitating Barbosa's memory. These works explaining that not all existing documents were destroyed as a result of his decision. Moreover, because of bureaucratic slowness that you know very well in Brazil, since that time, many offices around the country did not follow the order, and in some cases, copies of these documents were stored elsewhere as well. Then today it's largely accepted that the decree ordering then the burn of the documents was a measure to prevent the slave owners from succeeding in obtaining financial compensation from the Brazilian state. But it's worth emphasizing that preserving those records could also cause future legal problems to the old slave owners. First, some of these records probably contain evidence of the illegal importation of Africans after 1831, when the slave trade to Brazil was first abolished. And second, despite Barbosa's good intentions, scholars fail to emphasize that the decision to destroy the documents housed in the Ministry of Finance would also prevent possible future demands for financial reparations from the freed population to the former masters. The new Brazilian Republican government, after then the end of the monarchy, did not intend to put in place any official plan to support the newly freed population, as it was at least attempted here in the United States with the Freedmen's Bureau, at least attempted. In Brazil, we didn't have such initiative. Indeed, the new Republican government in Brazil that took control of the government then in November 1889 continued denying full citizenship to the freed population. With the approval of the Constitution of 1891, only male individuals older than 21 years old and with a high income had the right to vote. As for the freed population, like in the United States, Brazil witnessed the emergence of numerous black mutual aid societies, despite their particular features from the 1920s to the 1960s. Brazilian black organizations failed to make any demand for material and financial reparations. As it was the case here in this country, in the United States, here we had an important movement for pensions led by ex-slaves at the end of the 19th century. Brazil didn't see anything similar to that. Although in Brazil then land ownership, for example, remained concentrated in the hands of very few families of large landowners, during the rule of Vargas, then during already the 20th century, black Brazilian rural working then in the rural areas and in the urban areas, started obtaining better working conditions, especially then through the new constitution approved under Vargas in 1934, and the welfare laws that established at the time a unified system of social welfare that included then minimum wage, mandatory vacation, unemployment insurance, and retirement benefits. Then these progressive changes during the first 4 decades of the 20th century certainly positively affected the elder population, black population in the urban areas. Of course, then among whom there were former slaves and their descendants. But yet in a country where just 1/3 of the population lived in the urban areas, working in living conditions of rural workers continue to be very difficult. And although Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian populations then during this period, they continue to face then enormous social and economic exclusion, most black organizations fail to question the ideology of racial democracy that we can always discuss if you are not familiar with. But because legal segregation in Brazil, legal racial segregation never existed in Brazil, many black intellectuals and activists, they even embraced the view that harmonious racial relations prevailed in the country, which unlike the United States, Brazil, of course, did not experience then, according to this ideology, the problem of racial hatred and racism. But this is much more the fact that racism, of course, has been there and is still there, but was not manifested through such violent ways as it was the case here in the United States. And until the 1960s, the deception of racial democracy contributed then to prevent the emergence of public demands of financial and symbolic reparations for slavery in Brazil. But with the rise of the Cold War, Brazil had to deal with the need for agrarian reform to provide land to the enormous majority of its population is still living in the rural areas without access to land ownership. And resulting from these deep social and racial inequalities in the early 1960s, during the government of João Goulart, a growing movement of peasant leagues demanding land reform emerged all over Brazil. Unlike Castro, however, João Goulart intended to appease Brazilian society's inequalities through a reformist path. And after taking office in 1961, he established then an active dialogue with various peasant groups, many of whom were blacks, who for generations had remained without any access to land ownership. Goulart's government, as you know, embraced then a campaign to change the constitution to allow confiscated and unproductive land to redistribute this land through an agrarian reform. Yet, during the Cold War, and just 5 years after the Cuban Revolution, the United States perceived the implementation of these reforms as a communist threat. And any movements demanding reparations, even in this country, were then the leaders in this we have in the book. We are not talking about the United States here, but in the book then there was association among activists demanding reparations and the Communist Party of the United States. And many of these leaders, until the end of the 1960s, they were persecuted by federal authorities in the United States. Then there is a sort of dialogue that is happening here, even if it's not an organized movement. Then Goulart faced then great opposition from the military and different sectors of Brazilian elites and middle class as well, and supported by the government of the United States. The Brazilian military initiated a plot that resulted into a coup, and on April 1st, 1964, Goulart was deposed. This new context, as you probably know, hindered then the possibility of to black organizations to effectively fight racism and to fight for civil rights, and also prevented the emergence of call for financial and material reparations as it occurred here in the United States during the same period. Existing movements continue centering then their activities on publicly denouncing racism and call for the implementation of affirmative action when we are going to move towards the end of the dictatorship. And affirmative action in the Brazilian context is still presented as a reparatory measure, even though we know that is a symbolic form of reparation. I don't think that any African American, when you are discussing affirmative action, see affirmative action as a clear measure of reparation. But in Brazil, we call, let's say, that governments have called, organizations have called, even activists call affirmative action as reparatory measures. Other groups conveyed calls for reparations through a series of demands of cultural recognition. And of course, with the new democratic regime that started in 1985, even though elections only occurred in 1988, reparations for slavery were brought again to the public discussion. And the most important moment for this new context is really the Constitution of 1988, that not only criminalized racism, but also included the Article 68, determining that to the remnants of Quilombo communities who are occupying their lands, it is recognized to be definitive ownership, and the state shall grant them the respective titles, unquote. Then, 100 years after the abolition of slavery in Brazil, this new legislation opened a first breach to measures that could be interpreted as material reparations for slavery. But as in other former slave societies, there were many obstacles to affording restitutions to the communities and individuals identified as descendants of slaves. Starting in the 1990s, Brazilian black organizations led protests and introduced bills in the National Congress calling for financial reparations from the Brazilian federal government. In 1993, for example, black students and activists, and it's interesting as well because here is the student movement that is leading these demands, these calls for reparations, which was not the case, for example, in the United States, and I believe that anywhere else it is the student movement that is leading this. In 1993, black students and activists, members of the group of Black Consciousness in the University of São Paulo, created the Movement for Afro-Descendant Reparations, MPR. On November 1993, after a debate celebrating the anniversary of Zumbi of Palmares, 12 members of this group, they went to a very sophisticated restaurant, the Bela Vista restaurant in the Hotel Maxud Plaza in São Paulo, and they had a very expensive meal with drinks. Then they received at the end of the meal a bill of about $700. And then they stood up, showed their T-shirts with the slogan, Reparações já, reparations now, and then they left the restaurant without paying the bill. Following this demonstration, then the hotel, of course, sued the group, who eventually decided to pay the bill in court to avoid being sentenced as swindlers. Later on, in 1994, December 1994, the NPR submitted a declaratory judgment action to the federal court of the state of São Paulo, in which they requested that Brazilian state pay financial reparations to the descendants of the slaves. The document had an important political and symbolic dimension because, in addition to be signed by 12 activists, it also included the signature of a former enslaved woman, Maria do Carmo Jerônimo, that she was still alive in that year, 1994. She died in 2000, and she was born in 1871, before the passing of the Free Womb Law. Born then, and this is documented in Brazilian newspapers with pictures of her and so on. And in the document, they requested the court to recognize that 70 million Afro-Brazilians had the right to receive financial restitutions from the Brazilian state for the 350 years of slavery. The NPR argued that the Brazilian government was guilty of omission because despite the abolition of slavery in 1888, Afro-Brazilians never got social and economic emancipation, have remained prisoners of prejudice. It is important, however, to highlight that when referring to financial reparations, the various documents produced by the NPR do not use the term Black or Afro-Brazilian, but rather they use the category descendant of enslaved African, an identity then claimed by its members. And it's very similar to what happened here in the United States since the 19th century. We have the movement for ex-slaves, end of the 19th century until the beginning of the 20th century, and after that, the movements that emerge use this term, descendant of a slave. And of course, even the leader of the movement at the time, he underscored that defining the categories Black and descendant of a slave was not a simple task. In his own words, and I quote, "We want this identification to any descendant of African who was enslaved, independently of the skin color." Then 10 years after, this was 1994, 1995, 10 years after, before indeed, the approval of the law Taubira in France, this leader of, Fernando Conceição, that was the leader of this movement, he was also a pioneer in defining the enslavement of Black Africans as a crime against humanity. And of course, all these categories, they bring a problem because if you are going to consider ancestry, in the case of Brazil, we know that most part of the time is still the colorism is the element that determines if one is Black or white. And this, of course, is intertwined with all the discussion that we also had when implementing affirmative action in Brazil. But despite the NPR's strong arguments, the various organizations of the Brazilian Black movement never really supported the idea of financial compensations. The movement for reparations received great visibility from the media for about 2 years and even made the news in the Brazilian television show Fantástico, that is broadcast on Sundays. However, the newspaper Folha de São Paulo already by that time emphasized that the amount of financial compensation calculated at the time as nearly $100,000 to each Afro-Brazilian could represent $6.1 billion, as some 44 times the total value of the Brazilian external debt at the time. The declaration then calling for financial reparations was not successful at the end. And then later on, the next year in 1995, the NPR had its first national meeting in Rio de Janeiro. On this occasion, they discussed a campaign to gather 1 million signatures to petition for a bill requesting reparations for slavery. And it's interesting as well, because here in the United States, we had these movements requesting pensions. Then they were requesting signatures to introduce bills requesting pensions at the end of the 19th century. And we have these campaigns in Brazil demanding signatures to introduce a bill at the end of the 20th century. But despite its national scope, Afro-Brazilian activists were especially aware of the requests for reparations for the slave trade and colonization formulated in other places, especially by African nations during that time. Then the 1990s is a period when these demands were emerging elsewhere. And of course, even if these groups, they were not formally attached to other international organizations, they knew what was happening. And it was no longer the dictatorship then. The information was circulating. But over the following years, the idea of financial reparations for slavery again lost strength and public visibility. The main leaders of the Brazilian Black movement indeed never endorsed financial reparations. This is going to change a little bit in the early 21st century, when the Brazilian delegation will participate in the World UN Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban in 2001. And this was a turning point for the organization of Brazilian Black movement that gained whose agenda demanding different issues, especially then affirmative action, but other issues related also to forms of reparations, gaining great attention during the 2 terms of the government of President Lula that started, and he was elected in 2002, and he started his first term in 2003. In his first term, Lula implemented major changes regarding the legislation of symbolic reparations for slavery and affirmative action for the country's populations of African descent. In 2003, he issued a presidential decree expanding then the historical definition of quilombos. That historical definition is runaway slave community. But now, since this decree of 2003, the definition of quilombo includes also black communities communities of black poor peasants, who since the period that followed the abolition of slavery were historically excluded from access to land ownership. But despite these important achievements, the rule of the Workers' Party also contributed to institutionalize the Brazilian Black movement. Therefore, several Afro-Brazilians activists started occupying official positions in the government. And perhaps satisfied and probably optimistic about the new civil rights gains at the time, Black militants gradually neglected the idea of financial reparations. This context then confirms a tendency that I saw in other places, that the general trend is that when we have demands of reparations emerging, it's usually associated with periods of decline in civil rights. And now, as civil rights in Brazil in this moment were increasing, there was less interest in financial and material reparations. We can say then in Brazil that despite the favorable context for the development of affirmative action, in 2010, then this is 8 years ago, a man called Valdemar Medeiros, president of the Association Eduardo Banks, submitted an unexpected and curious proposal to the Commission of Participative Legislation of the Brazilian National Congress. This proposal requested the change of the Golden Law that abolished the slavery in Brazil in 1888 in order to establish, and I quote, the right to compensate the slave owners, their descendants, or successors, one quote. Without discussion, of course, the federal deputy who was leading the commission rejected the proposal. But you see that is still in 2010, we have people who claim to be descendants of slave owners who are making this kind of proposal. Of course, I'm not saying that this is a large movement and nothing like this, but it expresses that this memory, let's say, is still very present. Every other year, the issue of financial reparations in Brazil to the descendants of slaves makes a return to the Brazilian public scene, but always without much success, at least until here. In 2012, Claudete Alves, a black activist and teacher from São Paulo, presented a public civil action to the Public Prosecutor's Office against the Brazilian state, requesting compensation for the damages caused to all descendants of enslaved Africans living in Brazil and residing in the city of São Paulo. It was limited to São Paulo. According to Alves' lawyers, each slave descendant should receive 2 million reais, that is approximately $600,000. And in response to the request, the secretary of CEPIR at the time, then the secretary that, of racial equality, during the government, then this was 2012. This was still was already during Dilma. In response to the request, the secretary of CEPIR and longtime Afro-Brazilian activist, Matilde Ribeiro, she stated that the measures already approved during Lula's government were more efficient as reparation instruments. She underscored that for the Brazilian government, financial reparations were out of consideration. In 2012, the Commission of Human Rights and Participative Legislation examined another bill proposing the creation of a commission of compensation to the descendants of enslaved black Africans in Brazil that would determine the amount of financial reparations to the descendants of slaves. But unlike the precedent formulation by NPR in the 1990s, the proposed bill indicated that pecuniary reparations should be awarded to the individuals declaring themselves descendants of enslaved blacks and, between quotation marks, presenting phenotype or traits or documents proving this descent, end quote. Without then massive support from Brazilian black organizations again, which still preferred obtaining gains by negotiating directly with the government, the Senate Commission rejected the bill in July 2013. Then, despite the symbolic reparations implemented in Brazil since 2002, more than in other former slave societies, as the United States, for example, the scars of slavery in Brazil are very visible, remain visible in Brazilian public sphere. Social indicators confirm that Brazil's population of African descent have remained racially discriminated and socially marginalized. And if over the last 15 years, symbolic reparations in the form of initiatives to memorialize slavery in the country's public space were gradually developed, during the same period, the debates on financial reparations for slavery were not as visible as they were here in the United States. Brazil continued to be one of the most unequal nations in the world, although composing the majority of the population, Afro-Brazilians remain socially and economically excluded. In 2014, when we had the World Cup in Brazil, the international media devoted a lot of attention to the country, especially then to its black population. And an article published in two parts, indeed, in the Huffington Post, defined the movement of Brazilian Quilombo communities as the largest program of reparations for slavery in the world. But despite the article, the presidential decree of 2003 then the CEPIR, the secretary that, the ministry that took care of this issue at the time, estimated that in 2014, only 5% of Quilombola families were living in territories owning legal land titles. In fact, then, from 1995 to 2015, the federal government provided the legal ownership titles to only 164 Quilombo territories, in which more than 230 families, communities were settled. There were then more than 1,500 territories at that point in 2015 waiting their titles. Then the claim that Brazil has the largest program of reparations for slavery in the world is not accurate. Although Brazilian government authorities, academics, and many members of black organizations have employed the term reparations to designate a variety of measures associated with civil rights and cultural recognition, material reparations through land ownership remain an unachieved project in Brazil. And not by chance, then, in 2014, the Order of Attorneys of Brazil, the OAB, launched the National Truth Commission of Black Slavery in Brazil. And this is comparable to what we find here in the United States, to what is proposed in the bill H.R. 40, authored by Congressman Conyers. This committee, the committee is examining then the period of slavery in Brazil with the goal of reinforcing the importance of affirmative action as an instrument of reparations for slavery. But in the first preliminary report, the Commission's branch in Rio de Janeiro stated that for more than 3 centuries, Brazil, Portugal, and the Catholic Church were the main responsible agents for Brazilian slavery and the violation of human rights of Africans and their descendants. It also specified that the next step is to establish forms of reparations. Then, although not referring to material and financial reparations, the report's conclusion suggests that affirmative action and other symbolic measures implemented over the past years were unsatisfactory. Then to conclude, and the rest you are going to leave for the discussion, if until the 1980s the United States dominated the landscape of reparations activism, the last 2 decades of the 20th century marked a change in this paradigm. Yet the debate on reparations were shaped in different ways depending on the constitution of local black movements and how particular societies conceived the idea of race. In Latin America and Brazil, black activists and groups continue privileging symbolic reparations, except then for the demands for land ownership to black populations, the demands of civil rights and the fight against racism and affirmative action continue to prevail. But despite this context, a few requests for financial reparations evolved in Brazil. Moreover, black militants in Brazil, like in Colombia and Ecuador, succeeded also in obtaining the approval of new legislation on land redistribution to communities of African descent. Even though to this day, many of these groups remain fighting for the titles because these groups, these quilombola communities, they were recognized as quilombola communities. They receive some benefits from that recognition, but what they don't have are the titles. And it's important to emphasize that because when I ended finishing this, writing this book, it was a different period than it was before the parliamentary coup that occurred in Brazil. And at that point, perhaps there was hope, even if things were running slowly, there was hope that things would continue developing. And this is not what happened. Then now without the legal titles, it means that even these groups that are occupying land and who are recognized, they are still under threat of losing their lands. And I think that as a book, as any work that we do in terms of research, even they have an afterlife even after they are ready. And I think that discussing the issue of reparations, either in Brazil or in other places, can provide us with a framework to discuss how slavery was shaped in these societies, how the emancipation period progressed, and how are the challenges of the present. And in the case of Brazil, I think that the important lesson, if there is a lesson, is to see how persistent Brazilian elites have been since the period of slavery in keeping their benefits, their profits, and in detriment of the populations of African descent. And this is somewhat what you are seeing now, that all the changes that we saw over the last 20 years, for many people they were not happy with the fact that blacks, that domestic workers now can go to the university, that domestic workers now can take a plane. And this is a mentality perhaps that is very similar to what was happening in the debates that were seen during the period of abolition and the period that followed the abolition of slavery in Brazil. Then thank you so much. I will stop here, and if you have questions, let me know. Okay, go ahead.
What kind of methods were proposed to pay for financial reparations?
What kind of methods? There were several these different. You are talking about Brazil in particular. Then these were demands that were being made, especially then to give to individuals. In other cases, we were talking about give to entire groups. And other cases, but especially these demands, especially the last bills that we saw over the last 15 years, were bills that proposed individual payments to people. And then the problem, of course, of that, if these demands didn't go further, but they were requests to pay to individuals who were considered as either descendants of slaves and so on. And after, of course, if we refer to, because the lands for the Quilombola communities, these are material reparations, and the proposal here, of course, is to award the titles, first to recognize them and then award the titles to these communities that are communities that can prove that they have been in that land and they are keeping some traditions, that they have not only a connection in terms of their ancestors who were enslaved, but also that they are keeping some cultural traditions. This is the criteria when talking about collective, then to groups. But most of the demands that I read here during my presentation are demands that were focusing on individuals, to the descendants, then to pay individual reparations. Yes?
Thanks. I just really appreciated your presentation and scholarship in general. And I was thinking as you were presenting about kind of the method for discussing reparations and how historians have been engaged in that. And in this project, you do a lot to kind of sketch out the historical demands made by activists and groups and formerly enslaved people for reparations. And I was thinking of that in comparison to the work by someone like Hilary Beckles, for example, of making a demand for reparations through the history of slavery, and trying to do kind of like an accounting of what reparations should be made and in what ways. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to the idea of doing a history of reparations in the way that you have and how that might be related to that other demand.
Yeah, then this I didn't want to use all my time in the beginning of the, then it's nice that you bring this during the period of questions. The work that I do and that I have been doing over the last 15 years is to study memory of slavery, public memory of slavery, and how slavery is memorialized in the public space. When studying this, I recall very well, I was in Republic of Benin in 2005, reading articles in newspapers about the debates to create initiatives memorializing slavery there. And these debates on financial reparations was always mentioned. There is always this discussion. For example, here at Brown, we have a monument that was, I don't know exactly the title of the monument, but it's a monument to acknowledge then the responsibility of Brown in the Atlantic slave trade and how Brown benefit from it. Then this can be considered as a sort of symbolic reparations because there is acknowledgement, there are measures that are taken, but these are not financial and material reparations. And more and more this initiative that we see here, we see at Harvard, we saw recently in Georgetown, we see in Brazil, for example, with the teaching of African history and Afro-Brazilian history, we see with the creation of monuments, but when we come to talk about financial reparations, then the debate becomes contentious. And what I perceived when looking at bibliography about the topic to write my own work on symbolic reparations, then on memorialization of slavery, I noticed that there were very few, if any, works written by historians about reparations. Those who were writing about it are either, there are some economists, there are legal scholars who are writing to make the case for reparations, but historians, they haven't done so. Then we have Mary Frances Berry, who published a book a number of years ago on the movement for pensions. We have Finkenbein, who wrote 2 articles about early demands of reparations, especially in the 18th century in the United States. But there was a need, in my opinion, to historicize these demands, because there was a lot of assumptions in many of the scholarship by these folks who are not historians, saying that, oh, this is new. Reparations in the 1990s, these demands, this is something totally new that is happening, or referring to the UN conference of 2001 as a turning point, as something that was new. And I had a hard time to believe that only in these years, why only now people are requesting financial reparations. It is not because it's only now. People have been requesting reparations since the 18th century, indeed. And this is why I decided to write a book historicizing these demands, showing that these demands are not new, that they have a long history, and that organizations who demanded this over the centuries, they have been highly criminalized and contested. Then, as a historian, what I think that this kind of work can do is really to help, perhaps, it can serve as a tool for activists who are seeking reparations, that it can provide elements for them to understand what was done in the past, not only here but in other places, because in the overall book focuses on other areas as well. But as a historian, I don't recommend things. It's not my role. I cannot give recommendations on what reparations should be given, how much people should get, who should pay. And I don't believe that there is an answer for that can work in the United States and in Colombia, in Ecuador, and in Brazil. I still think, as a historian, that those who must determine that are the organizations who, the activists, then the people organized who are making these demands, and that they should vote for people who are bringing these issues to the table. Then this is why the work that I did, of course, Beckles, he did this book, and we had others, and I think that my work is much more the son or the daughter of the work of Mary Frances Berry than of Beckles, because Beckles is a work that is not, he is already between these two roles of being an activist who is leading the CARICON, and when he had this political project, which is great, because it's thanks to him and the CARICON that we have now all these discussions coming back here in the United States and in Brazil as well, more recently with the National Truth Commission. But I think that there is still very few works done by historians. And again, the book shows that in each of these areas and in each of these periods, there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of archival research. It's a work that is impossible to be done. For example, you cannot go to all the archives to look if there is something there, if there is anybody there asking for reparations. But perhaps in the future, the work that you will be doing, you'll be able to find other claims. And I think that the framework of reparations can be an interesting one to study the issue of slavery and the legacies of slavery. Not that what we are trying here is to find a solution or to offer a solution. I don't have that ambition, and I don't think that I am equipped to offer this kind of answers. Even if every time that I give talks about this work, I have questions on what should be done. I had questions also in the past regarding the monuments and things like this. For example, what we should do, should we remove the monument? What monument we should put in place? And I always respond that as a historian, I am interested in understanding the dynamic of memory, but not in offering solutions for the communities. The communities themselves, they have to do that. And of course, in the communities that I belong to, perhaps I can have an impact doing the work that I am doing, but not dictating. I don't think that we academics should be dictating what should be done, but we can contribute. Any other questions? Okay. I have one here and one there. Go ahead. You can go first.
I was just, thank you for your talk. It's totally new from the way you described it. I know you don't have a suggestion, but maybe you have an interpretation of how do you interpret the position of Matilde in 2014?
Could you repeat the question?
Can you repeat it?
Yeah, she's asking how do I interpret the position of Matilde Ribeiro at the time. Then this was in 2014 already? No, I think it's 2012. Yeah, 2014 was already a different period. There are several issues here. On the one hand, there was a clear emphasis on symbolic reparations if we consider, for example, affirmative action as symbolic reparations. Of course, that one can argue that once you have access to the university, you can improve your life and and the lives of your children and so on, that this can materialize in better economic and social conditions. Then there has been this emphasis on this element. But on the other hand, what she says that there were things already being done. For example, when you are referring to the Quilombo communities, which is true. Then the program itself, the Constitution of 1988, and after that the Decree of 2003, and what the entire work, then the entire change that this new legislation brought had certainly an impact. But of course, in 2012 and during the government of Dilma, then already during the first one, but during the second one, there was already a decline in terms of how many titles, how many communities were being recognized and how many titles were being awarded. And of course, that this is not only because of the entire dynamic of Brazilian society and the Brazilian Congress. Then the idea is, yes, there are things that are already being done, and the government does not have the resources to decide to simply award financial reparations to each person of African descent in Brazil. Then this is the way I interpret that. It perhaps from the point of view of the government, it was unfeasible. Many have been saying that it's unfeasible. But from the point of view of the movement, bringing the demands of reparations put emphasis that social exclusion and economic exclusion continue to affect largely the populations of African descent. On the other hand, of course, nobody would be expecting that 2 years later, the situation would be such that these conquests that were gained over the last 10 years would be under threat. And this is when the fact that these movements perhaps didn't remain as alive as they should during that period, this can have an impact now, because people, they were receiving things and were optimistic about what they were getting in terms of rights, but now the situation is different, and many of these groups, they are demobilized. But I think that her position is the position of any member of the government, in the sense that we don't have the resource to award, and you are already doing something. For example, here in the US, Obama was asked recently by Ta-Nehisi Coates why he didn't award reparations, and Obama in an interview said that, that the Health Care Act was a form of reparations. Then you see that it's always complicated, and from their point of view, some of the measures that they are taking are important measures, but are they long-lasting? Not necessarily. Then this is why we need to continue debating these issues. I don't know if I responded, because it's a difficult question.
Talk and wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the statute of racial equality, which I think is an interesting case during the period you're covering, right? Because it did originally, as it was introduced by Senator Paul, seek to be the kind of measure I think you're talking about. And during its time in Congress, which I think it sat in committees for 5, 10 years, so something like this, many, many years, it got watered down, right? And it was finally released when there was a Dane minister on the commission who had taken out the fund that was going to be behind the reparatory measures. And so the piece I'm wondering about is, it seems like if we look at, say, Pierre's role during this time, and we look at what happened to the black movement becomes bifurcated. That is, people are increasingly saying, we no longer like this thing, right? We liked it when Bala Paim proposed it, but it's no longer measure. And you had, say, Pierre saying, well, maybe it's not what it was, but it's in advance. And so it seemed like by the time it comes out, there's a tremendous split. And I wonder how you view, I guess, President Lula, Machilji, but say Pierre really, because it's the structure's role, and the black movement's role in relationship to this, because it seems like it's a kind of a complicated case to sort of tease out in terms of reparations.
Yes, it's interesting because when Paulo Paim introduced the statute of racial equality, it was in the 1990s. Was still a period when all the affirmative action was contentious, that there were people who were pretty opposed to the introduction of affirmative action, and that never passed. When it passed, as you are saying, then many of the elements were watered down, and of course the statute does not include measures regarding financial reparations. It's mostly symbolic reparations. Then we're talking about affirmative action in the universities, affirmative action also in other areas, for example, television, for also in the public service and so on. There was never big, it was a period that the black movement was just coming out from the period of the dictatorship. And of course that it was normal that at that moment the emphasis was on civil rights, because we were living a repressive period. But there were never, and I would say that in terms of what was the most important element that occurred in that period of transition is really when the black organizations mobilized themselves to for the introduction of the Constitution, then the question of the remnants of the Quilombo communities in the Constitution of 1988. In the book I talk a little bit more about that, how the sort of black caucus in Brazil was active to have that approved. But after that, the emphasis was always on symbolic reparations, and symbolic reparations do not necessarily, I would say, mobilize people to, for example, to exert more pressure. These channels continue to be much the channels, the bureaucratic channels. Now, especially then during the governments of the Workers' Party, instead of encouraging, for example, the population to to go to the streets and to mobilize as they were doing before the rule of the Workers' Party. Now the groups are, the organizations, they are negotiating. And there were things that were conquered through that. But the problem is that these were not necessarily, I would say, long-lasting changes. And and what happened with the statute is typical of what we see in Brazil in many ways, that it took so long that when it was approved, that there were people who were activists with 20 years old. They were 10 years old when that thing was introduced. That there was not even a memory of that. Then I would say that it's hard to answer, but essentially it was focused on symbolic reparations and did not, the Black movement didn't see in that, the Black movement or the Black movements didn't see in that an opportunity to give a step more, because there were many other things in play at that point, and things that were positive as well, that implemented positive change, even if now they are under threat. Yes?
So what kind of obstacles or dynamics do you think prevented the worker party governments from delivering on their promises, especially when it comes to the recognition of titles in Quilombo communities?
Well.
This would be an entire new work. That there are institutions, of course, that are characterized by being very slow, and there were a number of compromises that were being done with sectors that do not have the interest in making this process go faster. Then at some point there is, I would say, there are limits in how much compromise you can make with sectors that have no interest in doing that. And we return to, and this is why I think it's important to look at this history in transnational ways and to look at the past, because in '64, when one of the main elements of the program that João Goulart wanted to implement was to change the constitution to do something similar with what was done in 1988, allowing to expropriate the land. Now it's possible to do, but it's very difficult because all the mechanisms. And you know how the judiciary in Brazil is. There are, now it's fast for some, at some level it's fast, and when it is to, then this, we can just open the newspapers today to see how many of these then these politicians that were involved in this issue of related to Lava Jato, that now they are simply forgotten. But now, what could have been done? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It would be necessary to have a rupture with the sectors that didn't want these changes to be implemented. Now we can get other examples. There are examples that perhaps can illuminate that. We saw constitutions that are similar to Brazilian constitution in Ecuador and Colombia as well. Regarding populations of African descent and indigenous communities, and there are similar issues in play. And the places where this was implemented, that is the case of Cuba, then after the revolution in 1959, this was done by force. It was not an agrarian reform that people agreed that they were giving out their lands. Then this is a long history that is not in 10 years that can be changed. And I think that what we are seeing now in Brazil shows us very clearly, because when I was writing this book, perhaps it's still people, they had this idea, no, we are just walking towards something better. And it's not, it doesn't work like this. We have periods of ascension and periods of decline. And this, we are currently in the period of decline. If there are no other questions, we can perhaps have some conversation around, I don't know if you already had food or so, or a coffee. Perhaps you already have. But, or I will stay here, then we can always talk. Then thank you so much for coming, and it was a pleasure.